Minnesota came out with energy, especially early, and you could tell they wanted to speed the game up. But UCLA didn't respond emotionally. They stayed organized and let the game settle instead of forcing quick answers. The composure matters on the road. When you don't rush early, you give yourself time to read what the opponent is actually trying to do. Tempo was the first thing that stood out to me. UCLA never let the game get away from them, even when Minnesota tried to apply pressure. That patience simplified everything. Players weren't guessing or improvising. They were reacting to space and timing that already existed. Defensively, UCLA stayed disciplined the entire night. They didn't gamble or overcommit. They communicated through switches and forced Minnesota into late clock decisions. Minnesota moved ball at times, but they never really found a rhythm. Every possession required effort, and nothing felt comfortable. Interior presence played a big role here, especially in how possession stayed calm after missed shots. When the interior is stable, the rest of the floor settles. Rebounds are secured, kickouts are cleaner, and the game doesn't turn chaotic. That allowed the perimeter to stay patient. Guards didn't feel pressured to create something out of nothing. This game was really decided in the margins. Screen angles, closeouts, and clock awareness added up possession by possession. UCLA didn't respond to momentum with emotion. They responded with execution and discipline. You could feel the game getting heavier for Minnesota as it went on. So the big question is whether UCLA looked like themselves in this environment. For me, the answer is yes. They were composed, structured, and connected the entire night. That kind of consistency is what defines teams as the season moves forward. We'll see how that identity continues to show up, but this performance reinforced who they are.
Yes. Sergio, full script, based this only. Welcome back to the Sergio and Maria UCLA Women's Basketball Podcast. This show is built around how UCLA wins games. Not just the score, not just the box score, but the structure underneath the result. Tonight, we're talking about UCLA's road win against Minnesota. And before we get into details, it's important to say this clearly. This was not a game UCLA won by overwhelming Minnesota early. It wasn't a blowout that started as a blowout. It was a game that stayed controlled from the inside out. UCLA didn't treat early pressure as a threat. They treated it as information. They let the game show itself, and then they adjusted without breaking shape. That's what separates a team that survives road games from a team that controls them. This win didn't come from streak shooting or momentum swings. It came from patience, spacing, and decisions that stayed consistent, even when the environment wasn't comfortable. This is the type of win that travels. Not loud, not dramatic, but repeatable. Offensively, UCLA never let Minnesota dictate pace. Even when Minnesota applied pressure, UCLA didn't rush into early shots or force entry passes that weren't there. If the first action wasn't clean, they reset. What stood out was how rarely UCLA players drifted out of their lanes. Guards stayed patient. Posts didn't rush seals. Spacing stayed intact, even after broken actions. When spacing stays clean, decision-making simplifies. Players aren't guessing, they're reacting. That's when efficiency shows up without forcing it. Defensively, UCLA didn't gamble. They didn't chase steals. They stayed in front, communicated through switches, and forced Minnesota to play late into the clock. That kind of defense doesn't always produce turnovers, but it produces hesitation. And hesitation kills rhythm. UCLA wasn't trying to win the game in 5 minutes. They were trying to win it over 40. That mindset shows maturity. Interior impact isn't just about scoring. It's about gravity. When the paint demands attention, everything else becomes easier. Minnesota had to account for interior threats on every possession. Help defenders were forced to shade early. Passing windows widened just enough to keep the offense flowing. This is where Lauren Betts matters functionally, not as a headline, but as a structural anchor. Defenses can't ignore the paint, and that changes how the entire floor operates. Missed shots didn't turn into chaos. Rebounds were contested, secured, and turned into controlled resets. Kickouts were clean. Interior stability gave the perimeter freedom to stay patient. Guards didn't feel pressure to create something out of nothing. They trusted the structure underneath them. Screen angles. Closeouts that forced one more pass. Defensive possessions that ended with contested shots instead of breakdowns. Clock awareness. These are the margins that don't show up in headlines, but they decide outcomes. UCLA consistently made the right, small decisions. When Minnesota tried to string together momentum, UCLA didn't answer with quick shots. They answered with discipline. That's not talent. That's habit. And habits surface when pressure rises. This was identity basketball. UCLA stayed composed. They stayed connected. They didn't chase noise. They didn't drift from their principles. On the road, in a difficult environment, they trusted what they do. Wins like this matter because they're transferable. When shots don't fall, when crowds are loud, when games tighten late, identity is what remains. That's the Sergio and Maria UCLA Women's Basketball Podcast. We'll see you next time. What to do next? Do this now. Paste everything above into Huma. Select Sergio's voice, speed 0.95x, generate, export MP3. After that, you'll do Maria separately. If you want, next, I can give you only Maria's lines. Split this into segment by segment, Sergio files. Help you line everything up perfectly in CapCut. Just tell me the next step.